Imagine this. Your lungs are gasping for breath after being nearly strangled. You are stripped naked, not just of clothing, but of dignity. You feel the hands of the executioner grab your flesh, not to kill, but to dismantle. Your genitals are cut away. Your stomach is sliced open. Your intestines are pulled out slowly, methodically, and burned in front of your face. You can smell yourself dying, and yet you are still alive. This was not a punishment. It was a message. One carved into skin, burned into memory, and smeared across the stone of London for all to see. We sanitize executions in our history books. We turn them into clean facts, neat dates, and solemn ceremonies. But William Wallace, the man most people know from myth, rebellion, and Mel Gibson's Painted Face, did not die a clean death. He died a death designed to erase him, not just from life, but from history. He was hanged, but not until death. He was drawn, but not swiftly. He was quartered, but not before his very identity was torn apart. This was the highest form of state cruelty that medieval England had perfected, not simply execution, but public annihilation. The slow, conscious disassembly of a man who had dared to defy a king. What happened to William Wallace on August 23, 1305, wasn't just medieval brutality. It was psychological warfare, performed with surgical precision. And today we are going to uncover every agonizing moment of it. Before he was disemboweled before a crowd, before his limbs were nailed to city gates like butchered meat, William Wallace was a name whispered in terror across England. Not because he commanded an army, but because he commanded a symbol. Born around 1270, Wallace was no king, no prince, and no general by formal title. He was a minor noble, possibly even the youngest son of a knight. A man who should have vanished into history as a footnote if remembered at all. But what Wallace lacked in status, he made up for in something far more dangerous: defiance. By the end of the 13th century, England had suffocated Scotland under its rule. Edward I, remembered by history as Longshanks but known to his enemies as the Hammer of the Scots, had imposed English law, English taxes, and English troops across the Highlands. For most nobles, resistance was suicidal. Submission was safer. Wallace chose suicide. In 1297, he led a spontaneous uprising, striking at English garrisons with guerrilla tactics, unexpected, violent, and deeply humiliating to Edward's military machine. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace's vastly outnumbered forces defeated the English using strategic cunning that would become legendary. Overnight, he became guardian of Scotland. Not a crowned king, but something worse to the English throne, a folk king. To Edward, Wallace wasn't simply a rebel. He was a challenge to divine right, a nobody leading a kingdom against its appointed master. His face, his name, his survival, every part of his existence undermined the very architecture of Edward's control. In a medieval world where authority was God-ordained, Wallace's defiance was blasphemy. The English couldn't just kill him. They had to make an example of him, a warning etched into the psyche of every subject who might dare to think, if he can resist, why can't I? But first, they had to catch him. In the end, it wasn't the sword or the spear that brought Wallace down. It was betrayal, the most human and the most cowardly of weapons. By 1305, the tide had turned. Wallace's forces had been driven back. His brief hold on Scottish leadership had crumbled. The nobles, hungry for survival more than freedom, had begun to bend the knee to Edward. Wallace became a fugitive in the land he had once defended. For months, he lived as a ghost. No fixed location, no army, just shadows and sympathizers, many of whom were paid to turn a blind eye, or increasingly to open both eyes wide and report what they saw. The man who finally delivered Wallace to the English was John Death, a Scottish knight who had once fought beside him. Under cover of darkness, Wallace was ambushed and seized near Glasgow, not by foreign soldiers, but by his own countrymen. There is no darker psychological punishment than betrayal from those you once trusted. For Wallace, The shackles placed on his wrists weren't just iron. They were symbols of abandonment. The cause he had bled for, sacrificed for, had rejected him, quietly choosing compromise over defiance. And the English knew it. When Wallace was taken, he wasn't immediately executed. He was paraded, dragged south to London like a trophy, not to be hidden, but displayed. The symbolism was intentional. A chained enemy, eyes hollow with exhaustion, paraded like a captured animal for the English crowds. According to chroniclers, Wallace was forced to ride through villages, his head bowed only by the weight of iron, not of shame. Children were brought to mock him. Markets paused to watch him pass. He was a living corpse, and everyone knew what was coming. When he reached London in early August, he wasn't taken to a prison. He was taken to the Tower, the same fortress that would hold Anne Boleyn over 2 centuries later. But unlike Anne, Wallace wasn't even granted the illusion of noble dignity. His cell was a pit, his food minimal, his treatment brutal. But the worst was still to come. Because Wallace hadn't been brought to London for trial. He had been brought for theater. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace stood in the Hall of Westminster, not to plead his case, but to be publicly condemned. The trial was not a legal proceeding. It was a political performance. The outcome had already been carved into the scaffold. No defense was permitted. No lawyer stood by his side. When Wallace was accused of treason against the English crown, his response was brutally simple. "I could not be a traitor to Edward," he said, "for I was never his subject." It was a statement as true as it was damning. Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward I. He had never bowed, never signed, never submitted. But the trial wasn't about truth. It was about optics, the public humiliation of a man who had made kings bleed. The charges against him were piled high. Waging war against the king, slaughtering English soldiers, burning towns, spilling innocent blood, desecrating churches. Every rebellion, every resistance, every battle reframed as butchery. Every action against occupation recast as sacrilege. Wallace wasn't just portrayed as a rebel. He was painted as a monster, a savage, a lawless brute who defied king and God alike. Witnesses were summoned, most likely coerced and certainly biased. No evidence was offered, no cross-examination allowed. It wasn't a courtroom. It was a ritual designed to strip Wallace of legitimacy and, more importantly, strip Scotland of its hero. And the sentence was already written before he had entered the hall. He was to be hung, drawn, and quartered. The most severe punishment known in English law, reserved not for common murderers, but for traitors, for those who challenged the sanctity of the crown itself. But this wasn't just execution. It was deconstruction. Every phase of the sentence was deliberately designed to inflict agony, destroy legacy, and terrify onlookers. Let us break it down as the executioners would soon do to him. Today we use the phrase hung, drawn, and quartered as a dramatic metaphor, a grim exaggeration for something merely uncomfortable or unfair. But in 1305, those 4 words were not metaphor. They were anatomical, deliberate, and real. They were designed to break a man apart, both physically and symbolically. Let us be clear, this was not just about killing someone. This was about erasing them, reducing a body to meat, a mind to ash, and a legend to fragments nailed to city gates. The sentence for William Wallace read aloud before the court, and the crowd was as follows, and every word of it was soaked in ritualistic cruelty. He was to be dragged through the streets of London to the place of execution, tied behind a horse, stripped of all dignity, exposed to filth, mockery, and the jeers of the crowd. There he would be hanged by the neck, not until death, but until the brink of it. His throat would close, his lungs would convulse, his eyes would bulge, and then just before consciousness slipped away, he would be cut down, deliberately revived for the horrors still to come. While still alive, he would be emasculated, his genitals severed and cast into fire before his eyes, a symbolic unmanning meant to erase not only his masculinity, but his future. No heirs, no lineage, no legacy. Next, he would be eviscerated, His abdomen sliced open, his intestines slowly pulled out inch by inch, not to kill, but to torment, and burned before him while he still breathed. Every nerve-ending firing, every second a century. Then at last, the beheading, the only mercy he would receive. And even that was just the setup for the final horror. His body, now lifeless, would be quartered, hacked into 4 parts, and sent to distant corners of the realm. Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, Perth, each a warning nailed into wooden stone. His head placed on a spike at top London Bridge, staring over the Thames. A grotesque reminder that no rebellion goes unanswered. But even this recitation fails to capture the psychological genius behind the punishment. This wasn't just execution. This was state performance. Each phase told a story. The dragging. You are no longer a man. You are refuse. The hanging. We will let you taste death, then pull it away. The emasculation. Your bloodline ends here. The disembowelment. You will watch yourself die. The quartering. You belong to no one, not even the grave. And the most disturbing part, all of it was legal. This was justice by medieval standards, enshrined in law, approved by kings, carried out with precision and ceremony. Wallace was not merely condemned to death. He was condemned to become a lesson carved into the memory of a kingdom, a cautionary tale with no body left to bury. And on the morning of August 23rd, that sentence was carried out in full and in public. The execution began not with a sword nor a rope, but with a parade, a twisted procession of shame, humiliation, and state-sponsored spectacle. At dawn on August 23, 1305, William Wallace, bound in iron shackles, stripped nearly naked, was tied behind a horse and dragged from the Tower of London through the filthy streets of the city. Nearly 2 miles of agony, 2 miles of deliberate degradation. The route was no accident. It passed directly through the heart of London where the greatest number of people could see him. Markets, churches, crossroads, all crowded with men, women, even children. It was not a silent crowd. They had been encouraged, even coached, to jeer, spit, throw filth. And they did. Imagine it. Your body torn by chains, dragged over cobblestone and sewage, blistering under the sun, your skin flayed open by gravel, muck in your mouth, your legs numb, your arms bruised purple from shackles. But worse than the physical pain was the ritualized shaming. Your name once whispered with reverence in your homeland, now smeared with laughter and excrement. Some accounts suggest Wallace was lashed to a wooden hurdle, a flat cart pulled across the filth, a method designed not for his comfort, but to ensure his body remained intact for the suffering to come. The English didn't want him to die here. They wanted him to arrive just alive enough to feel everything else. There are no surviving English eyewitness accounts sympathetic to Wallace, but Scottish chroniclers later wrote that he was bloodied and gasping by the time he arrived at Smithfield, the open field just outside the city gates chosen specifically for its visibility. Here, amid the stench of livestock, refuse, and rotting corpses from prior executions, the crowd surged forward. This was not a private death. This was a national performance. Executioners didn't whisper, they shouted. Priests didn't comfort, they condemned. And Wallace, who had once led thousands into battle, stood, or was perhaps slumped half dead, as alone as any man could be. The real torment was just beginning. If the dragging had stripped Wallace of dignity, the hanging was designed to strip him of hope. On the execution field at Smithfield before a jeering mob and under the hot August sun, William Wallace was hauled up by the neck. The rope looped around his throat was not meant to kill him. It was meant to bring him to the very brink of death and leave him there. This was not the neat, neck-breaking drop of a modern hanging. There was no trapdoor, no clean break. This was the slow, torturous suffocation of the body hoisted by its own dead weight. Limbs flailing, face darkening, eyes bulging from their sockets, mouth open in a silent scream as the brain screamed for oxygen. His body would have spasmed, convulsed, perhaps urinated or vomited. His vision would have tunneled to darkness. His ears would have rung like bells. And then, at the exact moment his mind began to fade, they cut him down. Because death was not yet the goal. The goal was awareness. He would have collapsed to the ground, gasping, coughing, drooling, a man who had tasted the void and been pulled back from it like a plaything. Modern trauma psychologists might call this a near-death disassociation, a traumatic break in the mind, a form of psychological crucifixion. And yet, he still had not endured the worst. While Wallace likely could not speak by this point, he may have remained semi-conscious, eyes wide open, chest heaving, lungs torn, but alive, barely. Why keep him alive? Because the next act, the next ritual of terror required that he see it, feel it, know it. If the hanging was the brink of death, this was the descent into hell, laid out on a wooden bench or stretched across a scaffold. William Wallace was pinned down, his limbs restrained by iron loops or leather straps. The crowd leaned in, some laughed, some turned away. Most had never seen what came next. Fewer would forget it. With surgical cruelty, the executioner took a blade, not large, but razor sharp, and began the next phase, emasculation. Wallace's genitals were cut away, not quickly, not painlessly. This was no slash. It was a precise mutilation meant to last. His testicles were removed, his penis severed, and they were thrown into a brazier of coals right before his eyes. A symbolic annihilation. You will father no heirs. You will carry no manhood into the next world. You are unmade. This act was not simply physical. It was ritualistic erasure. In the medieval world, masculinity was inseparable from authority, lineage, honor. To castrate a man was to erase him from time itself. But Wallace wasn't dead. He wasn't even unconscious. The hanging had weakened him, but he was still present enough to feel, to hear, to see. And so came the next horror, evisceration. The executioner sliced open his abdomen from the groin up toward the sternum, exposing Wallace's internal organs. His intestines were then slowly drawn out, coiled like snakes, and fed into the fire that sat inches from his body. Contemporary sources, though sparse, indicate that the condemned could remain conscious for up to several minutes during this process, depending on how it was performed. If the organs weren't cut too deeply at first, the heart and brain would keep working, even as the body was opened like a book. Historians and physiologists agree the shock, pain, and heat of burning viscera would have triggered unimaginable agony. Blood loss would have been rapid, but not instant. The executioner's skill lay in prolonging the suffering, delaying the death, turning Wallace's body into an altar of pain. And the worst part, it was all done in silence. Not because Wallace had nothing to say, but because he couldn't say it. His voice likely choked, his breath reduced to gurgles, his vision blurred with tears and blood. Yet he saw, he felt, he knew. The fire, the crowd, the ritual. This was not just vengeance. It was a message, a psychological act of terror designed not just for him, but for everyone watching. By the time the blade came to his neck, William Wallace was no longer a man in the eyes of the state. He was a thing, mutilated, gutted, silenced, and yet he was still alive. There's no telling how much consciousness remained in Wallace's mind by the time the executioner took up the final blade. But the act was no less ritualistic for its lateness. The beheading was not the first stage of death. It was the last, the one afforded only after every ounce of agony had been extracted. With one swing, perhaps two, Wallace's head was severed from his body. The crowd roared. Some cheered, some vomited, others fainted, but no one left unaffected. The executioner lifted the severed head by the hair, as was tradition, and cried out, "Behold the head of a traitor." This was not mercy, it was punctuation. The final bloody period at the end of a national warning. But even this was not the end. Wallace's lifeless body was next subject to quartering. Each limb, arms, and legs still was hacked off, not with surgical precision, but with laborious axe blows. Flesh and bone cleaved with effort, sometimes requiring multiple strikes. Blood soaked the scaffold, spilled into the earth, and splattered the boots of those nearby. The body, already unrecognizable, was now reduced to 4 grotesque relics. Each quarter was destined for a different city chosen for its symbolic value. Newcastle to warn the north, Berwick to intimidate the borderlands, Stirling, a former seat of Scottish resistance, Perth, where Wallace once ruled as guardian of Scotland. Each quarter was salted, spiked, and displayed publicly. Nailed to gates, mounted on poles, or strung up like banners of flesh. They remained there for weeks, sometimes months, rotting in sun and rain, attracting flies, dogs, and ravens. As for the head, it was boiled, a grotesque preservation method, and then placed on a long iron spike at top London Bridge, facing outward toward Scotland. For years, travelers entering the city passed beneath the skull of William Wallace, a mute, decaying deterrent to rebellion. This was not justice. This was not punishment. This was state theater, and the body of William Wallace was its stage. The goal was not just death. It was destruction of memory, of mythology, of meaning. But that part failed. Edward thus believed that by destroying Wallace's body, he would destroy his legend. He couldn't have been more wrong. In the immediate aftermath, London exhaled. The spectacle was complete. Wallace was gone. His limbs were scattered. His head adorned the skyline. The king had made his point with fire, steel, and public horror. But in Scotland, something else stirred. News of Wallace's execution didn't suppress resistance. It fed it. Tales of the torture spread not as warnings, but as rallying cries. His suffering became symbol, his mutilation, martyrdom. Far from erasing him, Edward had amplified him, turned Wallace into a folk hero, not in spite of his death, but because of it. In the Highlands and borderlands, where English law was still resented and feared, people began to whisper his name again. The man who had been dragged through streets like refuse was remembered as a lion brought down by cowards. His final words, if any were spoken, were lost, but his image burned brighter in silence. Wallace's death did not end the Scottish Wars of Independence. It rekindled them. Within a year, Robert the Bruce would rise, inspired in part by Wallace's legacy, and take up the mantle of rebellion. Just 9 years after Wallace's execution, the Scots would win a decisive victory at Bannockburn, and Edward I's dream of a subdued Scotland would begin to collapse. In this way, Wallace's execution became an unintentional act of creation. His body was scattered, his life was ended, but his myth was born. And in that myth, the English made a fatal mistake. They forgot that pain can be remembered longer than peace. Wallace's fate also left scars on the English psyche. Few punishments in recorded history were as theatrical, deliberate, and psychologically constructed. It was a performance of power so extreme, it echoed through centuries. In later years, even English historians and poets would look back in horror at what had been done. Chroniclers who once mocked him began to write of Wallace with grudging respect as a man who suffered more than any traitor should. And in the centuries that followed, something even stranger happened. The sites of his execution became places of pilgrimage. The bridge where his head was spiked became a symbol not of English control, but of tyranny. And Wallace, butchered, erased, humiliated, would rise again, not as a criminal, but as a national symbol of freedom. The same state that tried to delete him had immortalized him.